In this video, we're going to go ahead and start slow. We're going to look at how we can select all columns and all rows from a table. And we'll do this in both SQL Server and we'll do this in Oracle. Now, one of the things to note is that we have a slide that's in our Murach slide deck that shows us what that simplified syntax of the select statement is. Now, when we look at this, the only thing that is mandatory is our select keyword with our select list, whichever the columns are that we want to return from our query. Now, we have an optional from clause, we have an optional where clause, and we have an optional order by clause. Now, the from clause is going to be where we specify the tables that we want to select from. Our where clause is going to be where we indicate what our search conditions are or how we want to filter our results that we're retrieving from the database, what those conditions are. And then we finally have our order by, which means that we want to specify the way that we want the data to be returned, in what particular order, by what fields, whether it's in ascending order or whether it's in descending order. Now, when we look at this from an Oracle perspective, the from is a required statement. So we don't have it where we're just going to have a select statement without a from statement. And when we get into using some of our functions in one of the videos this week, we'll take a look at what this looks like when you want to use a function but you don't necessarily have a table to tie it to. We can use a different table that they have set up for that purpose, and we'll take a look at it at that point. But right now, the thing that we want to get started with is we want to go to Azure Data Studio. We want to go through and we want to look at our Northwinds database, and the table that we're going to primarily use in this video is our customer table. When I expand my customer table, I can see that I have a customer ID, a company name, a contact title, address, city, region, postal code, country, phone, and fax field. Those are the fields that I want to have selected from my query that is going to return every row and every column. Now, in order to do this, I need to have a place where I can enter my query. And if I go and click on my Northwinds, I can do a new query and it's going to bring up a sheet that I can start adding queries to. Now, when I do this, notice that it has a database specified. This is going to be a query that's going to run against the Northwinds. Now, if I decided that I wanted to change that and I really wanted to run against the AdventureWorks 2019, I could do that. But really, we want to have it changed and run against the Northwinds. If I'm using SQL Server Management Studio, which is another tool that I can use for Microsoft instead of Azure Data Studio, if I bring this up, and I have a query window already set up here to go, if I want to actually run it here, and I have my tables, I can expand my tables and I can look at them. They should show the exact same information, same columns. I don't have that database dialog to select from. In order to actually specify which database I want to target, I have to use a use statement, and I would type in use Northwinds. This is going to then allow me to do the very exact same thing as that database dialog does. Now, every query that I write is actually going to target against this particular database until I tell it otherwise. So that's just one thing to note. I could then go through and I could start adding my statements and run them similar to what I'm going to do in Azure Data Studio. Now, if I come back over here and I decide that I want to select every particular field from that table, I'm going to do a little bit of a shortcut here. I'm going to add the first field, which is the customer ID. Now, there are two ways that I can specify my commas. I can specify my comma on the same line and then keep going where I'm doing my company name here, etc., etc. Or instead of putting it at the end of the line, I can put it on the beginning of the next line like this. So those are two practices that you'll see in play a lot of times. I don't really care which way you use it. I'm more accustomed to putting it on the same line, but that's just my preference. Now you'll see that there's squigglies here because I haven't entered my table. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. This is going to be in my from statement where I specify my table. Now when I look at my table, I have my customers table. That's my table name. The DBO is my schema name. I need to specify my DBO, which is the schema, followed by the customers, which is the table. Once I do that, notice that all the squigglies go away. Now, if I want to continue adding the fields, if I start typing the first couple letters, it's going to help me, and I can go ahead and just quickly, if I can spell right, pick the fields using some type of sensitive help here. So it's going to make it so that it doesn't take me quite so long to enter the information to put all of the fields here. When I run this query, and I need my semicolon here, it's going to return me the fields in exactly the order that I typed them in the column list. If I decided that I wanted the contact name first, I would have to put that before the customer ID. So it's going to return the fields in exactly the order that I specify in that list. If I decide that I want to change it up and I want to make it shorter, I have the option to do a select star from DBO .customers, and it's going to return exactly the same list to me. Now, if I was writing program code, I would write the full list, or I would just write out the fields that I would actually be using in the program. The reason we do that is because if we decide at some point we need to drop a field from the table, if we have select star indicated all over the place, we have to actually read into the code to figure out whether we're using a field somewhere or not. If we're explicitly stating that we're using the field within a SQL statement somewhere, then likely we need to find the code and modify it before we can drop the field. If, however, we look for that particular field, we don't find that field, then we know that we don't necessarily have to make any changes and it's kind of safe to drop that field. So we have to be very disciplined about our approach when we're actually doing our coding. Now, if I switch over to Oracle, in SQL Developer, we have our three connections. We have our CO and HR. Those were the user accounts that we created in the pluggable database, the XEPDB1 instance, and then ran schema into each of those user accounts to create the tables and views, etc. And then we had our XE that we set up initially that was then used to connect to that pluggable database so that we could create those user accounts. We are going to start out by using the XE connection to connect to our pluggable database and then go ahead and execute a query against that CO schema. In this case, we'll have to specify the CO in the select statement because we have a system account that has access to both of the schemas in that pluggable database, and we need to specify which particular schema that table exists within. Similar to what we're doing in SQL Server, we have a system account that we're using. That's the SA account. And when we connect to that SA account, it has access to all the different schemas. And therefore, we have to indicate that we're going against Northwinds, which is the database, and then what sub schema within that, because we've seen that we have sales, we have production, we have lots of different schemas in our AdventureWorks, and we would have to indicate which of the particular schemas we're accessing in order to find the table. So let's go ahead and get started. And first, to do that, we have to alter our session and set our container equal to the xepdb1. Once we execute this, and I'm going to move this up so I can see the results a little higher, our session is going to be altered. We're pointing to that pluggable database. Any queries that we run are going to go against that pluggable database. And I can go ahead and specify a query now. If I expand and connect to my CO, I have a shipments table. And this is the table that I want to go ahead and execute against using my XE session. And this is going to be shipment ID, comma, store ID, comma, customer ID, comma, delivery address, comma, shipment status. This is going to be from shipments. But as I indicated, we need to specify the schema. If we would execute it now, we'll see that it'll fail. If we put our schema here, it knows which particular user account it should be looking in to find the table. And now we can see the data for that. If we copy our SQL statement over to our CO session that was created when we connected, if not, you can always go into the worksheet, pick your connection, and it's going to create a worksheet for you to use. I can go ahead, since I am in my CO user account where the tables were created, I do not need to specify my schema. So I can just go ahead and say run without that, and it's going to show me the data. I can also go ahead and use the shortcut with the asterisk and execute this query, and it's going to essentially execute the same thing. Regardless of whether we're using SQL Server or whether we're using Oracle, this methodology works for retrieving all columns and all rows.